This is Group 5's LIS6210 group project. The members are Jacqueline Bradley, Kristin Falls, Remenapp and Leanne Swift. Our first step when we got the project was to develop a work plan that included due dates and responsibilities for each member. We determined what we were comfortable completing and created reasonable due dates for each step. After determining the division of work, we each began to work on our parts. Jacqueline began the task of creating one cohesive catalog using all of our individual catalogs. The following slides include the fields we used. Some were easy to determine without much discussion between us, while others required discussion between the 4 members to determine how we would use the fields. The Dublin core helped us determine which fields we would use and how we would use them. There were a few elements that we all agreed upon without having to discuss it. Those elements were creator, description, dimensions, rights, subject, and title. There were a few elements that we had to discuss between the 4 members. Those elements were contributor, identifier, publisher, source, and date. The first field we discussed was that of identifier. Some of us had used the VI number and some of us had used the URL as the identifier. Our final determination was to use the URL because according to the definition in our book, it lists URLs as an example of an identifier for a network source, which is what is being used here. The next field we discussed was contributor. Some of us had Joan listed as the contributor, but she did not contribute to the intellectual content, which according to our textbook, it specifies that the contributor has to make contributions to the intellectual content of the resource. So our final decision was to list Joan as the publisher, not the contributor. The next field we discussed was publisher. Some of the group had listed the collection name as the publisher, but according to our textbook, the publisher is the person who's responsible for making the resource available in its present form, and for this collection of items, that was Joan. So our final decision was to put her as the publisher. The next field we discussed was source. We all had various sources listed, and the textbook defines source as a reference to a resource from which the present resource is derived. So we finally decided that we would use the name of the collection along with the URL as our source. The next field we discussed was date. Group members had used 2 separate date fields, the date published and the date created, and also listed was using the coverage field for the date the object was created, and our final determination was to use 2 separate fields. There wasn't a given consensus throughout on a controlled vocabulary, so we decided to use the Library of Congress subject headings because they're widely used and it has enough flexibility to accommodate our cataloging needs. The first conclusion we reached was that original cataloging can be extremely difficult. Each cataloger can interpret the fields in different ways, so that makes it hard for 4 people to come to one consensus. And there needs to be discussion between catalogers so that everyone can be on the same page. If we all have the same definitions of the fields, it's easier for us to all come to one agreement on how something should be cataloged. Our next conclusion was that asking questions such as what is the most important and what will most people want to know, discover, was helpful in determining which elements to use and how to use those elements. The end result is how the users are accessing the information, so that's what you need to consider when you're cataloging. Our final conclusion was that consulting the Dublin core descriptions and the Library of Congress subject heading authorities helped us have common ground to start with, so that we were all on the same page to begin having discussions about how we would catalog the items.